Kumanthong's curse. The tragic fall of a young family. In this terrifying encounter, David, a man once well off and comfortable, stumbles upon a tragic twist of fate when he recognizes two old friends, Mark and Sarah, now homeless and destitute. Upon inviting them to his house for a meal, David learns that they had fallen into hard times after experimenting with a dark and cursed ritual involving a haunted doll from Thailand known as the Kumanthong. Desperate to improve their financial situation, Mark and Sarah adopted the spirit attached to the doll, hoping for prosperity. However, things took a sinister turn. As David digs deeper into their story, he uncovers horrifying truths about the doll's demands blood sacrifices, whispers of vengeance, and the chilling control it holds over their lives. The doll spirit, named Emily, takes the form of their young deceased daughter, terrorizing not only Mark and Sarah, but also those around them. David, skeptical at first, soon finds himself at the mercy of the malevolent spirit, witnessing Emily's terrifying appearances and destructive influence. The haunted doll exacts a heavy toll on Mark and Sarah, ultimately leading to tragic consequences. David's life too becomes intertwined with the curse as he battles the malevolent spirit to free his friends from its grip, only to realize too late that some doors, once open, can never be closed. Part 1. A chance encounter. The rain was relentless that evening, pounding the windshield of David's old sedan as he drove through the dimly lit streets. His wipers screeched rhythmically, barely keeping up with the torrent that fell from the dark, brooding sky. David had just finished a grueling day at work and was eager to get home to sink into the comfort of his worn-out couch and let the day's stress fade away. He hadn't seen anyone on the road for miles. The streets eerily deserted, save for the occasional flash of headlights slicing through the gloom. As he approached a long stretch of road lined with broken streetlights, something caught his eye. Two figures huddled together under one of the few remaining working lamps, their bodies barely more than shadows in the downpour. David squinted through the rain, his brow furrowing. Something about them tapped at his memory, a flicker of recognition sparking in his mind. He slowed the car to a crawl, his heart inexplicably beginning to race. No, it can't be he muttered to himself, eyes wide as realization dawned on him. It was Mark and Sarah. David's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen his old friends in years, but there was no mistaking them. The couple looked broken. Mark's once broad shoulders were hunched under a soaked jacket, and Sarah clutched a tattered bag to her chest, her hair matted and hanging in limp strands around her pale face. They were shadows of their former selves. David's foot instinctively slammed on the brake, his car coming to a jerking halt a few yards away from where they stood. His pulse quickened as he threw the car into park and fumbled with the door handle, almost stumbling out into the storm. The cold rain hit him like a wall, instantly soaking through his clothes, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the two figures who hadn't even looked up at the sound of his car. Mark, Sarah, he called out, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and concern. Mark's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear, like a deer caught in the headlights. For a moment, he seemed frozen, his gaunt face a mask of disbelief. Sarah clutched her bag tighter, her eyes darting around as though searching for an escape. "David?" Mark croaked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. David took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell happened to you guys? He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The last time they'd been together, Mark and Sarah were thriving, full of life and laughter. Now, they looked like they had crawled out of a nightmare. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His eyes, hollow and dark, flickered to Sarah, who shook her head almost imperceptibly. David's concern turned to frustration. He took another step forward, determined to get to the bottom of whatever had happened. "Come on, get in the car. You're coming home with me," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mark hesitated, glancing at Sarah again. She looked terrified, her eyes wide and her body trembling, as if she were afraid of what might happen if they went with him. But David wasn't about to leave them out there in the rain. He grabbed Mark's arm, his grip tight, and pulled him towards the car. "I'm not leaving you here," he insisted. Reluctantly, Mark and Sarah followed, their movements slow and hesitant, like two ghosts being dragged from the underworld. As they slid into the back seat, David caught a glimpse of Sarah's face in the rear-view mirror. Her skin was pale, almost sickly, and there was a haunted look in her eyes that sent a shiver down his spine. He pulled back onto the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the relentless thrum of the rain and the occasional sniffle from Sarah. David's mind raced with questions, but he didn't dare ask them, not yet. They drove for what felt like an eternity, the darkness outside pressing in on them, making the air inside the car tick with tension. David could feel it, something was terribly wrong. Mark and Sarah weren't just homeless. There was a deep, unsettling weight hanging over them, something that went beyond the physical, something that gnawed at the very edges of his reality. Finally, they arrived at David's modest house. It was a small, cozy place, the kind of home that felt lived in and warm. Normally, David would have found comfort in the familiarity of it, but tonight, even the house seemed ominous in the shadows cast by the storm. He parked the car in the driveway and turned to look at Mark and Sarah. "Come on inside," he said softly, trying to ease the tension. "We'll get you cleaned up, and you can tell me what's going on." Mark nodded slowly, but Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed on something far away, something only she could see. David's stomach twisted with unease, but he pushed it aside, opening the door and motioning for them to follow him inside. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside, but it did little to thaw the coldness that clung to Mark and Sarah. They stood awkwardly in the entryway, dripping water onto the hardwood floor, their clothes clinging to their frail frames. David grabbed a couple of towels and handed them over, watching as they wiped the water from their faces and hair, though it did nothing to rid them of the shadows that seemed to linger over their every movement. "Sit down," David urged, gesturing to the worn-out couch in the living room. "I'll get you something warm to drink." As he moved into the kitchen, he couldn't shake the image of his friends standing in the rain, like lost souls in the middle of a storm. Something had happened to them, something terrible. And he wasn't going to rest until he found out what it was. When he returned with steaming mugs of tea, Mark and Sarah were sitting side by side on the couch, their hands clasped tightly together. The tension between them was palpable, a silent scream that filled the room. David sat down across from them, setting the mugs on the table. "Okay," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Now, will someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. Her eyes were wide, pleading, as if she were trying to convey something to Mark without saying it out loud. David's unease deepened. "Guys, seriously," he pressed. "I need to know. You look like you've been too held off for a long moment." There was nothing but silence. Mark's hand trembled as he reached for the mug of tea, his fingers barely able to grip the handle. He took a shaky sip before setting it back down and looking David dead in the eyes. "It's our fault," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We messed with something we shouldn't have." David frowned, his confusion growing. "What do you mean? Messed with what?" Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "There's something evil, David, and it's following us. We thought we could control it, but his voice trailed off, and Sarah let out a small, choked sob. David's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, evil? What the hell did you get involved with?" Mark's eyes filled with tears, his face pale and gaunt under the dim light of the living room. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice breaking. "We just wanted to make things better. But now it's too late. We can't get rid of it. We can't escape IT. David leaned back in his chair, his blood running cold. He had no idea what Mark was talking about, but the terror in his voice was enough to send chills down his spine. Something dark, something dangerous was haunting his friends, and it was far from over. And in that moment, David knew he had been pulled into something far worse than he could have ever imagined. Part 2. Unveiling the Secret. The air inside David's living room felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself had absorbed the tension from its unexpected guests. The flickering glow of the fireplace danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to grow and shrink in rhythm with the crackling flames. Yet, despite the warmth, David could feel a chill creeping into his bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Mark and Sarah sat huddled together on David's couch, their postures tense and weary. Sarah, still clutching her threadbare back, seemed on the verge of breaking down, her eyes constantly flicking to the corners of the room, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the reach of the light. Mark, pale and gaunt, stared into his lap, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. David sat across from them, leaning forward in his chair, his brow furrowed with concern. He could sense that whatever Mark was about to say was weighing heavily on him. The silence between them had stretched for too long, and the longer it went on, the more oppressive it became. Finally, David broke the stillness. "Mark, what happened? You said you messed with something evil. What did you mean by that?" Mark didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the floor, his expression one of deep shame and regret. Sarah let out a small shuddering breath, her knuckles white as she gripped her bag even tighter. David noticed her lips quiver as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Then Mark began to speak, his voice hoarse and hollow. We were desperate, David. Things got really bad after you last saw us. We were struggling financially, emotionally. Everything was falling apart. He paused, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. We didn't know what else to do. David nodded slowly, trying to keep his tone gentle. I get it, man. But what did you get involved with? You said something about something evil. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes finally meeting David's. The fear and anguish in his gaze made David's stomach twist. It started innocently enough. I came across this article online about a ritual, a way to bring good fortune. It was strange, but I thought maybe it could help. David's frown deepened. A ritual? What kind of ritual? Mark hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who was now staring blankly ahead, her lips moving silently, as if reciting a prayer. Something from Thailand, Mark continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. They call it Kumanthong. It's a kind of doll, but not just any doll. It's said to contain the spirit of a child. People believe that if you take care of the doll, if you follow the rituals, it can bring you wealth and success. David's heart skipped a beat. A knot of dread forming in his gut. You're telling me you bought one of these dolls? Mark nodded, his face paling further. Yes, we traveled to Thailand. We found a place, a temple deep in the countryside. The monk there, he gave us the doll, told us how to care for it, what to do to keep the spirit happy. At first it seemed harmless, almost comforting in a way. We were desperate, David. We thought this could be our way out. David felt his skin crawl. The idea of inviting a spirit into their home, even if it was under the guise of wealth and prosperity, sounded like madness. But as he looked at Mark and Sarah, he could see just how deeply that desperation had taken root in them. There were people clinging to the last shreds of hope, no matter how dark the path might be. What happened after you got the doll? David asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon the thing into the room with them. Mark's eyes glazed over, as if he were reading the events in his mind. At first it worked. Things got better. Our finances improved, we had customers flooding into our shop, and money was coming in faster than we could keep up. It was like a dream, David. But it didn't last. Sarah let out a sob, her hand flying to her mouth, as if she were trying to stifle the sound. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she shook her head violently. her body trembling. It wasn't a dream, she choked out, her voice filled with horror. It was a nightmare. We didn't realize what we'd brought into our home until it was too late. David leaned forward, his heart racing. What do you mean? What happened? Mark's hands clenched into fists on his knees, his knuckles turning white. The doll. The spirit inside it. It wasn't satisfied with just the rituals. It wanted more. It started small whispers in the middle of the night, strange shadows moving through the house. But then it started asking for blood. David's eyes widened in disbelief. Blood? What the hell are you talking about? Mark's voice was barely a whisper now, his words trembling. It wasn't much at first, just a few drops here and there, but the more we gave it, the more it wanted. Every night we had to make an offering or something bad would happen. Bad? David echoed, his throat dry. What kind of bad? Sarah spoke this time, her voice shaking uncontrollably. It started with small things, broken dishes, strange noises. But then it got worse. Doors would slam shut on their own. Furniture would move. And then we started seeing her. David felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Seeing who? Emily? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide and unblinking. Our daughter. We started seeing her. But it wasn't really her, David. It was a doll. It was using her image to torment you as. David's stomach churned. Emily. He remembered Emily, Mark and Sarah's daughter. She had passed away years ago, a tragedy that had left both of them devastated. The thought of her spirit being manipulated by something dark and sinister made his skin crawl. You're saying the doll made you see Emily? David asked, his voice trembling. Like a ghost? Mark nodded slowly. It wasn't just seeing her, David. She was there, walking around the house, playing in her old room, laughing. But it wasn't her. We knew it wasn't her. It was a doll, pretending to be her, trying to lure us in, trying to make us give it more doubt. David's mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. The idea of a spirit haunting them, taking the form of their dead daughter, was almost too much to comprehend. But as he looked into Mark's eyes filled with fear and regret, he knew that they believed every word of it. So what happened? Why didn't you just get rid of the doll? David asked, his voice rising with urgency. Mark let out a bitter laugh, his eyes dark with despair. We tried, David. We tried so many times. But it wouldn't let us. Every time we tried to throw it away, it would come back. We'd leave it somewhere, and the next morning it would be sitting on the kitchen table, staring at us with those eyes. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing through the room. We're trapped, David. We can't get away from it. It's bound to us. We can't escape. David's mind whirled. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something far darker, something that had its claws deep into his friends, refusing to let go. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the oppressive presence of something evil lurking just out of sight. There has to be a way, David said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. There has to be a way to stop it. Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with hopelessness. We've tried everything. We've been to priests, shamans. No one can help us. The spirit is too strong. It feeds off of our despair, our fear. The more we try to fight it, the stronger it becomes. David felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a battle for their very souls. But you can't just give up, David said, his voice trembling with emotion. There has to be something you can do. Mark looked up at David, his eyes hollow and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. We've already lost everything, David. Our home, our business, our lives. We're just shells now, waiting for the end. David's heart ached for his friends. They had been consumed by something dark and terrible, something they could no longer fight. But as he sat there, staring at the broken couple before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something he could do. I'm not going to let you give up, David said firmly, his voice filled with determination. We'll find a way to stop this. We'll figure it out. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Mark's eyes filled with tears, his voice cracking as he spoke. Thank you, David. But I don't know if there's anything left to say. David reached out, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. We'll get through this. I promised Doc, but deep down, David wasn't sure if that promise was one he could keep. As the storm outside raged on, the real storm inside the house was only just beginning. Something dark and malevolent had taken hold of Mark and Sarah's lives, and now it was threatening to consume David as well. The Kumanthong was not just a doll. It was a doorway to something far worse, a nightmare from which there might be no escape, and David had just stepped right into its clutches. Part 3. The Dark Pact. The rain outside continued its relentless assault on the windows, the sound a constant, eerie backdrop as the storm raged on. Inside David's house, the air was thick with tension and fear. Each breath drawn in felt heavy, suffocating. David sat in his worn armchair, leaning forward, his eyes locked on Mark, who sat across from him, looking like a man haunted by his own demons. Sarah was curled up beside Mark, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, as if hoping the fire could burn away the memories. Mark's hand shook as he reached for the cup of tea David had made, but his grip was unsteady, and the cup rattled against the saucer. His face, once full of life, now looked gaunt, with deep-set eyes that told the story of a man who had stared too long into the abyss. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper, like the weight of the words he was about to say would break him. It started small, harmless. "Ivan," Mark began, his voice shaking as though each word was a struggle. "After we got the doll, things changed so quickly. It was like we had opened a door to a world of endless possibilities. Our business took off. We were getting clients left and right. Orders were pouring in. For the first time in years we felt lucky." David listened intently, but his stomach churned as he sensed where this was going. He had heard enough stories about curses and pacts to know that nothing came without a cost. The weight of that cost was clear in the haunted expressions of his friends. Mark took a shaky breath, his eyes flicking to Sarah, who remained silent, her face pale and blank. "At first it was almost comforting," he continued. "The doll, it looked so much like Emily. It felt like having her with us again. We thought maybe somehow she had come back to us. That this was her spirit watching over US doll." David's chest tightened at the mention of Emily. He had known the couple before their daughter's death, back when they were a happy family. He remembered the joy in their faces when they talked about her, the sparkle in their eyes that died the day they buried her. The thought of them clinging to any shred of hope that Emily had returned, even in the form of a cursed doll, was heartbreaking. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "But it wasn't Emily, not really. It was something else, something dark wearing her face. And we didn't realize that until it was too late." David leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as a chill ran down his spine. "What happened? When did you start noticing things weren't right?" Mark swallowed hard, his hand gripping the edge of the couch, as if he needed to hold on to something to keep himself grounded. "At first it was small things," he explained. "We'd hear her laugh at night, see a shadow moving through the house. It felt strange but not threatening. It was like she was just there, watching over US." He paused, his brow furrowed as if remembering those early days. "But then it started making demands." David felt a chill run down his spine. "Wrong? How?" Sarah shuddered, her voice trembling as she spoke. "They were empty, cold, like she was looking at us but she wasn't really seeing us. And then she started speaking." She hesitated, her lip quivering as she remembered the words. She would whisper things, horrible things. She said she was lonely, that she wanted more, that if we didn't keep giving her what she wanted, she would take us with her. David's blood ran cold. The thought of their daughter's spirit, if that's what it truly was making such dark demands, was terrifying. It was clear that the doll had become something far more than a vessel for a child's soul. It had turned into a parasite, feeding off Mark and Sarah's fear and grief, using their memories of Emily to manipulate them into doing its bidding. Mark's voice broke as he spoke again. We thought we could handle it, that if we kept following the rituals, it would stop. But it never stopped, David. It got worse. She got worse, thought his eyes were wide with fear as he looked up at David. She started controlling us, making us do things we never would have done otherwise. Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night with her hands bleeding, and we didn't know why. I'd find myself standing in front of the door, offering more and more. And I didn't know how I got there, thought David felt a wave of nausea wash over him. You mean you weren't in control of your actions? Mark shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. No, she was controlling us. We were like puppets, doing whatever she wanted. And if we didn't, she would punish us. David's throat tightened as he imagined the nightmare his friends had been living in. They had made a deal with something dark and malevolent, and now they were paying the price. But the worst part was yet to come. David's eyes widened. Demands? What kind of demands? Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide and terrified. Milk, she whispered, her voice trembling. It started with milk. We'd leave a glass of milk by the door each night, and it would be gone by morning. We thought it was a harmless offering, something to keep her happy. David's skin prickled with unease. But it wasn't just milk, was it? Mark shook his head slowly, his face pale. No, it wasn't enough. The doll, or whatever was inside it, wanted more. After a few weeks, the milk wasn't enough to satisfy it. That's when it started asking for blood. David's breath caught in his throat. Blood. The word seemed to hang in the air like a curse, the room growing colder as it was spoken. Mark nodded, his face twisted in shame and horror. Yes, just a few drops at first. I didn't think much of it. I pricked my finger, let a couple of drops fall into a bowl by the door, and that seemed to calm it down. But the more we gave, the more it wanted. Every night he would ask for more. David's hands tightened into fists, his pulse racing. Mark, you can't be serious. You were offering blood to that thing? Mark's gaze dropped, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. I didn't know what else to do, David. It was controlling us. If we didn't give it what it wanted, bad things started happening. The shop would flood. Things would break. And then we started seeing Emily more often. David's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the horror his friends had been living with. The doll had become more than just a physical object. It had become a gateway for something dark, something that was growing stronger with every drop of blood they offered. The Emily they were seeing wasn't their daughter. It was something else, something far more sinister, wearing a face like a mask. Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't her. It wasn't our Emily. It looked like her, sounded like her, but the things it would say, the things it would do, they weren't our little girl. She would stand at the foot of our bed at night, just staring at us. Sometimes she'd laugh, but it was this horrible, twisted laugh. And her eyes were round out. Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, her tears flowing freely now. We tried to get rid of the doll, David. We tried so many times. We burned it, we buried it, we threw it in the river. But every time it came back. Every single time it was sitting there in the house, waiting for us. And each time it was angrier. Each time. It demanded more. David's hand shook as he listened, his mind racing. How could they have gotten involved in something so dark, so dangerous? And how could they possibly escape it now? There has to be a way to stop this, David said, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. We'll find someone who can help, someone who knows how to deal with these things. Mark shook his head, his voice filled with hopelessness. We've tried. We've been to priests, to shamans, to anyone we thought might be able to break the curse. But nothing works. Every time the doll comes back, and every time she gets stronger. David's heart sank. His friends were trapped in a living nightmare and there seemed to be no escape, but he couldn't let them give up. There had to be a way out, even if it meant going to the ends of the earth to find it. "I'm not going to let this thing destroy you," David said firmly, his voice filled with determination. "We'll figure it out. We'll find a way, Dot." But even as he said the words, the shadow of doubt loomed large in his mind. The Kumanthong was more than just a haunted doll. It was a malevolent force, one that had already claimed Mark and Sarah's lives, and now it was reaching for him too. As the storm outside continued to rage, David knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The real nightmare had yet to begin. Part 4. The Haunting Begins. The storm outside rumbled on, as if echoing the turbulence inside the house. The crackling fireplace cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the atmosphere thick with an eerie sense of foreboding. David sat on the edge of his seat, his heart pounding as Sarah's words filled the room with a chilling dread. Sarah's voice, soft but trembling, broke the silence. At first it was subtle, she began, her eyes wide, as if she were reliving the horror with each word. It was almost like she was our Emily again, Dot, she hesitated, glancing at Mark, who sat silently beside her, his face pale and drawn. We heard her laugh. We saw little things, a toy moving on its own, her favorite blanket appearing in the living room. It felt comforting, like she was watching over you as David could see the pain in Sarah's eyes, the hope she must have clung to in those early days, believing that their little girl had returned to them. But he knew he could feel it, that the story didn't end with comfort. He leaned in, hanging on her every word. But then, things changed, her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat as her gaze drifted to the floor. She started to show herself more, appearing at the foot of our bed in the middle of the night. At first she looked just like Emily, smiling, waving, like she was trying to tell us everything was okay. But Sarah's voice cracked, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but hollow, as if he too had been hollowed out by the ordeal. He spoke softly, his voice low and broken. "It wasn't her, David. It looked like Emily, sounded like her, but it wasn't her. Not really, Dot." David felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He knew where this was going, but hearing it from Mark and Sarah made it all the more terrifying. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah wiped her tear-streaked face and tried to compose herself, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "It's hard to explain," she said quietly. "At first he seemed so real. We wanted to believe it was Emily. We wanted to believe she had come back to us, but the longer she stayed, the more we realized how wrong it all was." She paused, taking a deep breath, and continued. "She would appear at night, just standing there. At first she didn't say anything, just stared. But then the staring turned to whispering. Sarah's eyes locked onto David's, and he felt his stomach tighten with unease. She would whisper horrible things that no child should ever say. Things about death, about pain. She would talk about taking us with her. David's heart raced. "Taking you with her?" Mark nodded, his face ashen. "Yeah, she said we would never be apart again. That if we didn't listen to her, she'd make sure we joined her. Forever, Dot." David's throat tightened, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. The thought of Emily, sweet, innocent Emily, turning to something so dark and twisted was horrifying. But he knew it wasn't really her. It was the doll. The cursed Kumanthong using their grief as a weapon, twisting their memories into something monstrous. How did it get to this point? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual. At first we just heard her. Then we started seeing her more frequently, and she began making demands. The milk, the blood. We thought it was harmless at first, just some weird ritual we didn't understand. But the more we gave, the more she wanted. David felt a wave of nausea wash over him as Sarah's words sank in. What kind of demands? Mark's jaw tightened and his voice was laced with bitterness. At first it was just milk, like Sarah said. We'd leave a glass by the door and it would be gone by morning. But then, one night, it wasn't enough. She started asking for blood. Our blood. David's mind reeled. Blood? From you? Mark nodded grimly. Yeah, we'd prick our fingers, leave a few drops in a bowl beside the door. It seemed to keep her calm for a while, but then she wanted more. It got to the point where we were bleeding ourselves dry, just to keep her from ... trailed off. His voice choked with emotion. From what? David asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah's eyes darted to the window, as if she expected to see Emily standing there, watching them even now. From hurting us, she whispered. She started hurting you. David's stomach dropped. Hurting you? How? Mark lifted his sleeve, revealing a series of scars running up his arm deep, jagged cuts that had long since healed but left behind a trail of pain. She would make us cut ourselves. Sometimes we'd wake up in the middle of the night with fresh wounds. And we wouldn't even remember doing it. It was like we were possessed. Like she was controlling you. David's hands clenched into fists as he tried to process the nightmare his friends had been living through. Mark. Sarah, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you just get rid of the doll? Mark let out a hollow laugh, the sound bitter and devoid of hope. We tried, David. We tried everything. We burned it, buried it, threw it in the river. But no matter what we did, it always came back. Every single time it was there, sitting in the house, waiting for us. And each time it was angrier. Each time it demanded more. David's pulse quickened. He had heard of cursed objects before, but this was something else entirely. What happened after that? He asked, though part of him dreaded hearing the answer. Sarah hugged herself, as if trying to shield her body from the memories that haunted her. It got worse. So much worse, she said, her voice shaking. She started appearing during the day. At first it was just glimpses out of the corner of her eyes in the reflection of a mirror. But then she became bolder. She would stand in the middle of the room, smiling at us, like she was daring us to do something about it. David's chest tightened with dread as he pictured the scene. Did you ever try to confront her? Tell her to leave? Mark shook his head, his expression one of pure fear. No, we didn't dare. Every time we thought about fighting back, something bad would happen. The lights would flicker, furniture would move on its own. And then one night, Sarah, she woke up screaming. David's heart pounded in his chest. What happened? He asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked at Mark, her face pale and drawn. I saw her, she whispered. Emily. She was standing at the foot of the bed, but she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was twisted. Her face, it was wrong. It was like something had stretched her skin too tight, and her eyes, they were glowing, red, like fire. David's breath caught in his throat, as Sarah's description painted a picture of pure terror. What did she do? He asked, his voice trembling. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she clasped them in her lap. She climbed onto the bed. She crawled over Mark and she whispered in my ear. She said she wanted more. David's stomach churned as he imagined the scene. More blood. Sarah nodded, her face contorted in pain. Yes, but not just blood. She wanted us. Our souls. She said she was lonely, that she needed company, and that if we didn't give her what she wanted, she would take us with her to wherever she was going. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the horror unfolding before him. What did you do? How did you stop her? Mark let out a bitter laugh. We didn't. We couldn't. We were trapped. Every time we tried to fight back, she would make things worse. She started throwing things around the house, shattering mirrors, breaking furniture. And then she started appearing outside Dot. David's eyes widened in shock. Outside? You mean? She was following you? Mark nodded grimly. Yeah, we'd see her standing in the driveway or at the edge of the yard, just watching us. And every time we saw her, something bad would happen. A car would break down, an accident would happen at the shop. It was like she was everywhere, watching us. Controlling US thought David felt his heart pounding in his chest as the full weight of what his friends had been through sank in. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a nightmare that had taken over their lives, consuming them from the inside out. And now Mark's voice trailed off, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. Now she's stronger than ever. We don't know how to stop her. We don't even know if we can. David swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He had to do something. He couldn't let his friends continue to suffer like this. But as he looked into their haunted eyes, he realized one horrifying truth: this was far from over. The Kumanthong had claimed their lives, and now it was reaching out for his. Part 5. Emily's Terror. The room was drenched in tension, the crackling fire now nothing more than a low hum under the weight of Sarah and Mark's story. David's mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmarish tale. The air had grown colder, biting at his skin despite the warmth of the flames. His eyes flicked between Mark and Sarah, their faces drawn and haunted. It wasn't just their story that unnerved him, it was the way they spoke, as if they were still trapped in that nightmare, as if something unseen was still lurking in the shadows around them. He opened his mouth to say something, anything to break the oppressive silence, when suddenly the lights flickered. David froze. The overhead bulbs dimmed and buzzed as if struggling to stay alive. His heart leapt into his throat, and his skin prickled with unease. A low, eerie giggle echoed through the room, faint but unmistakable. It was the laugh of a child, playful, innocent but twisted by something far more sinister. Sarah let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as her eyes widened in horror. "No, no, not again," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark stiffened beside her, his hand clutching hers in a white-knuckled grip. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if expecting Emily to materialize right then and there. "She's here," Sarah choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's always here, watching, waiting. She never leaves." David's pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. He wanted to say something rational, to dismiss the giggle as a coincidence, a trick of the mind. But he couldn't, not after what he had heard, not after the story Sarah had just told. The room grew goofy, possibly cold, and the flickering lights dimmed further, casting the room in long, twisted shadows. The giggling continued, faint but persistent, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It sent chills down David's spine. Sarah's breathing became ragged, her hands shaking violently as she clutched the edge of the sofa. "She's too strong now," she whimpered. We can't control her anymore. She's not Emily. She's something else, something evil." Mark stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. His eyes were wide, wild with fear. "We've tried everything, David. We can't get rid of her. She won't let us." David's mind spun, a deep sense of dread gnawing at his insides. He could feel it now. Something was watching them, something dark, cold, and malevolent. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let the fear consume him. "Where is it?" David demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Where's the doll?" Sarah's eyes snapped to him, wide and fearful. "No," she breathed. "You don't want to see it. You don't want to bring it here. She's connected to it. If you bring it out, she'll. The lights flickered again, and the giggling grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking Sarah's fear. David gritted his teeth. He could feel the oppressive presence pressing in on them, suffocating them. But he couldn't back down now. "Show me the doll," he repeated, more firmly this time. "If we're going to stop this, I need to see it." Mark hesitated, his hand shaking as he glanced at Sarah, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "David, I don't know if that's a good idea, I don't care if it's a good idea," David shot back, his patience wearing thin. "This thing is terrorizing you. It's controlling you. We need to face it." Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he considered David's words. Then, with a resigned nod, he turned and walked toward a door at the end of the hallway. David's stomach churned with anxiety as he followed, the floor creaking ominously beneath his feet. As they approached the door, David felt a suffocating weight in the air. The closer they got, the colder it became. It was as if the room itself was rejecting their presence. Mark hesitated with his hand on the doorknob, his face tight with fear. He glanced back at David, his voice a whisper. "Once we open this door, there's no going back," David nodded, his throat dry. "Open it," Mark swallowed and turned the knob slowly. The door creaked open with an agonizing groan, revealing a small, dim-lit room. In the center, on a dusty old table, sat the doll. David's breath caught in his throat as he laid eyes on it. The doll was no ordinary toy. It was small, no bigger than a toddler, with a porcelain face and wide, staring eyes. Its features were delicate, almost beautiful, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The eyes seemed too real, too alive, as if they were watching him, seeing into his soul. Its tiny mouth was frozen in a faint, twisted smile, the kind that seemed innocent at first glance but grew more menacing the longer you looked at it. The doll wore a simple white dress, tattered and stained, as if it had been through hell and back, and its hair black as night hung in tangled strands around its face, casting eerie shadows across its pale skin. David stepped closer, every fiber of his being screaming at him to turn around to run. But he couldn't. He was drawn to it, mesmerized by the malevolent energy radiating from the doll. This is Emily?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, his face ashen. "That's what she calls herself. But it's not her. It never was," David reached out hesitantly, his hand trembling as it hovered over the doll. The air around it felt electric, charged with a dark energy that made his skin crawl. The giggling that had filled the room earlier now echoed faintly in his ears, growing louder as his fingers brushed the fabric of the doll's dress. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered violently, and a cold gust of wind swept through the house, rattling the windows. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang, making David jump. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no one there. The giggling grew louder, more menacing, as if it were coming from right behind him. David turned back to the doll, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, its smile stretching wider, as if it were feeding off the fear in the room. "David, we need to leave," Mark said, his voice shaky. "She knows we're here. She knows you're here," but David couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the doll. The air around him grew heavier, colder, and he could feel someone standing behind him, breathing down his neck. He could hear it now. A voice, a whisper, soft but clear. "Stay with me, David." It was the voice of a little girl, Emily. But it wasn't the sweet, innocent voice of a child. It was twisted, hollow, dripping with malice. David's blood ran cold. "David," Mark shouted, snapping him out of the trance. "We have to go. Now." David stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The doll's eyes followed him as he moved, its smile widening, as if it were mocking him. Mark grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "Come on." Just as they reached the door, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The giggling grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the walls like a twisted symphony of madness. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped into the light. It was Emily. But she wasn't the sweet little girl they remembered. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, pointed teeth. She floated above the ground, her feet barely touching the floor, her body swaying unnaturally as she moved toward them. "You can't leave me," she whispered, her voice cold and menacing. "You promised you would stay forever." David's breath caught in his throat as Emily's twisted form floated closer, her eyes locked onto his. He could feel her presence pressing down on him, suffocating him with fear. "David," Mark shouted, pulling him toward the stairs. "Run." They bolted down the hallway, the sound of Emily's laughter echoing behind them, growing louder and more distorted with each step. David's heart raced as they reached the bottom of the stairs, but he could feel her presence right behind him, her icy breath on the back of his neck. They burst through the front door and into the cold night air, the wind howling around them. But even as they ran, David knew one thing for certain: Emily wasn't done with them yet, and she never would be. Part 6. Facing the door. David's heart thudded in his chest as he crossed the threshold into the room. The door creaked behind him, sealing him in what felt like a tomb. The air was instantly different, heavier, colder. His breath turned visible, misting in the sudden, biting chill. The dim light from the hallway barely pierced the gloom, casting long, wavering shadows that danced ominously around him. In the center of the room, perched atop a low, dusty table, sat the doll. It was smaller than he expected, but that did nothing to lessen the sheer malevolence that seemed to radiate from it. The porcelain face was delicate, with wide, glassy eyes that shimmered in the low light. Its small mouth was curved into a faint, eerie smile, a smile that seemed far too knowing, far too real. David swallowed hard, his pulse racing. It wasn't just a doll. He knew that now. It was far more than that. The air grew colder still, the temperature plummeting with each step he took toward it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back, to leave this cursed room and never return. But he couldn't. Not with Mark and Sarah still trapped in the grip of this nightmare. He had to face it. He had to end this. As he inched closer, the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, the flickering light growing dimmer. He could feel something watching him, something hungry, something waiting. Then, the doll's head moved. It was slow, deliberate, a sickening twist of porcelain that sent a jolt of pure terror through David's spine. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing as the doll's head turned, ever so slightly, until its lifeless eyes locked onto his. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the doll's tiny mouth came a sound. David ... The voice was soft, childlike sweet, almost innocent. But there was something else beneath it, a darkness, a malice that made his blood run cold. "I'm part of them now," the doll continued, its voice lilting like a child's lullaby, but twisted with something sinister. "Mark and Sarah. They belong to Emmy." David's breath caught in his throat, his mind spinning. The doll was talking. No, not just talking, it was claiming ownership of his friends. His hand shook as he clenched them into fists, trying to gather his courage, trying to push back the rising panic threatening to swallow him whole. The doll's smile widened, its glassy eyes glinting in the half-light. "You can't save them, David. They're mine. Just like you will be." David took a step back, instinctively retreating as the room seemed to close in around him. His skin prickled with cold, and his heart pounded against his ribs. He had to do something, anything, to break the grip of this cursed doll. But before he could move, a cold gust of air swept through the room, and the shadows began to shift and writhe. And then, from the corner of the room she appeared. Emily. At first she was just a shape, a dark outline, barely distinguishable from the swirling shadows. But as she stepped forward, her form became clearer. She was small, her body that of a young girl, no more than 6 or 7. Her pale skin was almost translucent in the dim light, her dark hair hanging in limp strands around her face, and her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. She floated toward David, her feet never touching the ground. The room seemed to grow colder with every inch she closed between them, the air thick with her presence. David's throat tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as she stopped just a few feet from him. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a ghostly echo of the doll's. "Stay and play. Forever." David stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold, damp wall behind him. His heart raced, his mind screaming for him to run, but his legs refused to move. Emily's pale face was only inches away now, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth twisted into a mockery of a child's smile. "I'm so lonely, David," she continued, her voice soft but chilling. I just want someone to play with. You'll stay, won't you? David shook his head, his mouth dry. No, he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. No, I won't. Emily's smile faded, her hollow eyes narrowing. The room seemed to darken, the cold intensifying until it felt like David's bones would freeze and shatter. But you have to, Emily hissed, her voice losing its childlike sweetness, replaced by something far more menacing. You can't leave. You're mine now, just like they adored. David felt the room closing in on him, the walls pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The temperature dropped again, the frost creeping up the windows, turning the room into a frozen tomb. Emily's ghostly form hovered closer, her eyes fixed on him with a hunger that sent terror searing through his veins. Suddenly, the doll's voice cut through the air, cold and commanding. David, stop fighting, His eyes darted back to the doll. Its head had turned fully now, facing him with that grotesque smile, its glassy eyes gleaming in the flickering light. David's stomach churned as the realization sank in the doll wasn't just a conduit for Emily. It was Emily, or at least whatever malevolent force had twisted her spirit into this. They gave me to her, the doll continued, its voice hollow, emotionless. They thought they could control me, but now I control them, just like I control you. David's mind raced, the pieces of the nightmare falling into place. Mark and Sarah hadn't just been haunted, they had willingly invited this entity into their lives, believing they could harness its power. But they were wrong. They had become slaves to it, trapped in its web of darkness. And now it wanted him too. I won't let you have me, David spat, his voice trembling with both fear and defiance. The doll's smile widened, and Emily's ghost let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound so twisted and inhuman it made David's skin crawl. You don't have a choice, Emily whispered, her breath icy against his face. I've already started. You're already mine. David's chest tightened as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. He could feel her presence, like icy tendrils wrapping around his heart, squeezing the life out of him. He had to get out. He had to break free. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, David pushed himself off the wall, his breath ragged and shallow. Emily's form flickered and swayed in front of him, her hollow eyes watching his every move. The doll, still perched on the table, seemed to pulse with dark energy, its tiny mouth curving into that sickening smile. David's hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the cold porcelain of the doll's arm. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows spinning around him as a wave of nausea hit him like a freight train. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let Emily win. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, David snatched the doll off the table, his fingers closing around its fragile neck. The moment he touched it, the room erupted into chaos. The windows rattled violently, the floor beneath him trembling, as if the very foundation of the house was being torn apart. The cold became unbearable, stabbing into his skin like needles. And then Emily screamed. It wasn't the scream of a little girl. It was a sound of pure rage, a howl of fury that echoed through the house, shaking the walls and sending shivers down David's spine. Her ghostly form convulsed, flickering in and out of existence, as if the connection between her and the doll was being severed. No, she screeched, her voice distorted, shrill. You can't take her away from me. She's mine. David's grip tightened around the doll's neck, his heart pounding as the room seemed to collapse in on itself. Emily's form lunged at him, her hands reaching out, her face twisted in fury. But David didn't back down. He couldn't. With a final surge of strength, he twisted the doll's head. For a moment, time stood still. Emily's ghost froze in midair, her hollow eyes wide with shock. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, the cold biting into David's skin like razors. And then, with a deafening crack, the doll's head snapped off. The room exploded in a blast of icy wind, sending David stumbling backward. Emily let out one final, blood-curdling scream before her form shattered into 1,000 pieces, dissipating into the shadows. The doll's body went limp in David's hands, the lifeless porcelain crumbling to dust. The air in the room grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the shadows receded. It was over. David collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his hands trembling. The cold lingered, but the malevolent presence was gone. Emily was gone. The door was nothing but dust. But as David lay there, staring at the remnants of the cursed doll, a chilling thought crept into his mind. Had he truly won? Or had Emily merely found a new way to stay with him? Part 7. Trapped by the curse. David's breath caught in his throat as the door slammed shut behind him with a thunderous bang. The sound echoed through the room, reverberating in his chest like the toll of a death knell. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, a sickening realization creeping over him. The air around him felt heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was breathing with malevolent intent. He was trapped. The cold swept through the room again, far more intense than before. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, like the very essence of death had seeped into the walls, pressing down on him, suffocating him. His breath formed clouds in front of him, but no amount of shallow breathing could calm the panic rising inside his chest. From somewhere within the darkness he heard it, a giggle. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it carried with it a malice so pure, so raw, that it froze his blood. David spun around, eyes wide, searching the corners of the room, but there was nothing, only shadows, twisted and coiling as if alive, lurking just beyond the reach of the faint, flickering light. And then the giggle came again, louder this time, closer. David ... The voice was soft, lilting, that of a child, but there was no mistaking the malevolence behind it. It curled around his name like a serpent, wrapping tighter and tighter, until it felt like he was being strangled by the very sound of it. His mouth went dry, his legs locking in place as his eyes darted wildly across the room. David, you can't leave. The voice danced around him, flitting through the air with terrifying grace. The shadows moved with it, shifting and twisting, hiding the presence he knew was there. His pulse raced, panic tightening its grip as he backed up toward the door, his trembling fingers brushing against the cold metal of the doorknob. But no matter how hard he twisted, it wouldn't budge. The door was sealed shut, locked tight by something far more powerful than any physical mechanism. He was trapped in a web of darkness, woven by the spirit that was now toying with him, Emily. Her laughter filled the room again, a haunting, eerie sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. David's back hit the door as he pressed himself against it, his breath quickening. He could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on him now, suffocating him with every second that passed. They tried to escape, but I caught them. Emily's voice whispered, closer now, almost in his ear. He flinched, his body jerking involuntarily as he turned his head, expecting to see her standing there, hovering beside him, her hollow eyes locked onto his, but she wasn't there. Not yet. Her voice filled the room again, a ghostly melody that sent shivers down his spine. You won't leave either, David. You stay here with me. Forever. The shadows seemed to thicken, crawling along the walls like living creatures, surrounding him, closing in. His chest heaved, each breath a struggle as the room seemed to shrink around him. The walls pressed in, the cold sank deeper into his bones, and that laughter, that haunting, chilling laughter kept echoing, bouncing off the walls like a twisted lullaby. David's eyes darted across the room, searching desperately for a way out, for something, anything that would break this hold Emily had over him. But there was nothing. Nothing but shadows and that damn doll. Now a pile of dust on the floor, its cursed influence lingering in the air, like a noxious fog. He couldn't think, couldn't even breathe properly. The terror was all consuming, gnawing at him, threatening to devour him whole. He had thought he could fight this. He had believed foolishly that he could free Mark and Sarah from the clutches of this nightmare. But he hadn't freed them. He had only walked himself into the same trap. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flicker of something in the corner of the room. His heart skipped a beat, his muscles tensing as his gaze locked onto it. For a moment, the shadows parted, and there she was. Emily. She hovered just inches above the floor, her small, ghostly form cloaked in the same tattered dress she had worn in life. Her hair hung in dark, matted strands around her face, framing her pale, translucent skin. But it was her eyes that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over him, those hollow, glowing orbs that held nothing but darkness, nothing but hate. She smiled at him. It was the smile of a predator, a smile that held no warmth, no kindness, just hunger. "I'm going to keep you here, David," she whispered, her voice soft and sickly sweet, like a child promising to share a secret. "You'll never leave me. You'll never escape." David's throat tightened, his mind racing as he took an involuntary step back. The shadows moved with him, closing in, cutting off any hope of escape. Emily drifted forward, her small, ghostly form floating toward him with an unnatural grace, her eyes locked on his. "You belong to me now," she whispered, her voice echoing inside his head, crawling into his mind, infecting his thoughts. "Just like them, Dot." David's body trembled, fear coursing through his veins like ice. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the darkness wrapping around him like chains, pulling him deeper into Emily's twisted world. "No," he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I won't let you." But before he could finish, the air around him grew impossibly cold, and Emily's form shifted, her innocent facade melting away. Her face twisted, her features contorting into something grotesque, monstrous. Her smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the faint light. "You don't have a choice, David," she snarled, her voice no longer that of a child, but something far darker, far more malevolent. "Your mind." The shadows around him surged forward, closing in, suffocating him, and Emily's laughter filled the room, a high-pitched, maniacal sound that echoed through his skull. David's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had to fight. He had to find a way to break free, to escape this living nightmare. But how? The curse had wrapped itself around him, its tendrils burrowing into his very soul, binding him to this place, to Emily's malevolent will. He had seen what it had done to Mark and Sarah, how it had broken them, consumed them until there was nothing left but hollow shells of the people they once were, and now it was happening to him. A sudden surge of adrenaline shot through David's veins. No, he wasn't like them. He wouldn't give in. He wouldn't let this curse take him. With a cry of desperation, David lunged toward the door, his hand slamming against the wood, rattling the frame as he twisted the knob. But it wouldn't move. The door was sealed shut, locked by something far stronger than any physical force. Behind him, Emily's laughter grew louder, more maniacal, as if feeding off his fear. "You can't escape, David. No one ever escapes, Dot." David's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing as he frantically searched the room for another way out. The shadows danced around him, their twisted forms mocking him, taunting him. He was trapped, caught in a web of darkness, with no way out. But then, something caught his eye. Across the room, on the far wall, was a window. It was small, barely large enough for a grown man to squeeze it through, but it was his only chance. David didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the window, his feet slipping on the cold, damp floor as he ran. The shadows swirled around him, clawing at his legs, trying to pull him back, but he pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily's voice echoed in his ears, her laughter going shrill and frenzied. "You can't leave. You're mine. You'll always be mine." David's hands reached the window, his fingers scrabbling against the cold glass as he fumbled to unlatch it. His breath came in panic gasps, his hands shaking as the shadows closed in around him. He could feel them now, cold and suffocating, wrapping around his arms, pulling him back. But then, with a final twist, the latch gave way and the window creaked open. David didn't waste a second. He shoved the window up, his body trembling as he climbed in through the small opening, his legs kicking against the shadows that tried to drag him back into the room. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pulled himself through the window, his body collapsing onto the cold, wet ground outside. The moment he hit the ground, the oppressive weight of the curse lifted, the cold air of the night filling his lungs like a lifeline. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide as he looked back at the house, his breath coming in panic gasps. The window slammed shut behind him, and through the glass he could see her Emily, her twisted, monstrous face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes burning with rage. David stumbled back, his chest heaving as he stared at her, his body trembling with the weight of the terror that still clung to him. But he had escaped, for now. Part 8. No Way Out. David stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, the hairs on his arms standing upright as he fought to steady his breathing. Sweat dripped down his temples despite the icy cold that gripped the room. The terror clung to him, suffocating him, seeping into his every thought and movement. The door that had slammed shut moments ago now felt like a steel wall behind him. He was trapped, caught in Emily's twisted web of nightmares. He had no escape. The air around him was thick, oppressive, as though it had weight and unnatural pressure pushing him down, making every breath a struggle. He turned his gaze back toward the cursed doll, sitting in the corner of the room like a forgotten relic of an era long gone. But he knew better. That doll wasn't abandoned. It was waiting, watching. Its empty eyes seemed to bore into his soul a silent, sinister invitation. And then the laughter started. Low, at first barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, sharper, until it filled every corner of the room. It wasn't the playful giggle of a child anymore. No, this was something far darker. Mocking, malicious, filled with a sadistic glee. Emily's voice, once soft and innocent, now dripped with malice, her true self slipping through with every haunting sound. David ... the voice called out, teasing, curling around his name like smoke. He spun around, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing, just the shadows, deeper now, more menacing. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the malevolent energy swirling around him. He could feel the curse tightening its grip, the darkness seeping into his bones. Suddenly the temperature plummeted and the lights flickered wildly, casting jagged, erratic shadows that twisted across the room. The doll's head, which had been turned toward the wall, now snapped to face him. The sound of the movement, a sharp, bone-cracking snap, made his stomach turn, and then, to his utter horror, the doll began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stood up, its porcelain limbs creaking like old wood as it took a step toward him. David stumbled back, his pulse roaring in his ears. His body screamed for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the very air felt alive with malevolence. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any means of escape, but his mind was clouded by fear, pure, unadulterated terror that made it impossible to think clearly. "You can't leave," David. Emily's voice was no longer the soft, innocent tone it had once been. It had taken on a twisted, guttural quality, as though her very soul had been corrupted by the curse. "You're mine now. You belong to Emmy." The shadows in the room began to shift and writhe, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to crawl along the walls, their long, spindly fingers reaching out toward him. He could feel the weight of the curse pulling him deeper into the nightmare, its tendrils wrapping around his mind, clouding his thoughts. Every step he took backward felt like he was sinking into quicksand, being dragged down by something unseen. Emily's ghostly figure materialized in the center of the room, her once innocent features now distorted into something monstrous. Her face twisted unnaturally, her eyes hollow and glowing with a sickly yellow light. Her mouth, stretched too wide, curved into a smile that dripped with malice, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Her form flickered like a dying flame, glitching between the childlike figure she once was and something far more sinister, something ancient and hungry. "Stay with me, David," she whispered, her voice layered with both a childlike plea and a monstrous command. "Stay and play forever." Frog tightened and bile rose in the back of his mouth. He was paralyzed, his legs refusing to move. His body felt heavy, as though weighed down by chains only he could feel. His mind screamed at him to fight, to do something, anything, but fear held him captive. Emily floated closer, her ethereal form flickering as though it were barely clinging to this world. Her long matted hair hung in front of her face, but he could see her eyes, those horrible, glowing orbs piercing through the strands. "You belong to me now," she hissed, her voice echoing in his mind, twisting through his thoughts like a vine. "Just like them, ... Suddenly, David's vision blurred, and in a split second, he was overwhelmed by a flood of images. Mark and Sarah, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies bound by invisible chains. He saw them kneeling before the doll, their eyes hollow, lifeless, as they offered it milk, blood, anything to satisfy its insatiable hunger. The room around them had been just like this, one dark hole filled with a palpable sense of dread. They had been trapped just like him. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. There was no way out. The curse had consumed them, and now it had him. David's chest heaved, each breath more labored than the last as he staggered back toward the door. He clawed at the doorknob, frantically twisting it, but it was no use. The door was sealed, locked by some invisible force that he couldn't break. His heart pounded in his chest, the terror rising like a tidal wave as Emily's laughter filled the room, going louder and louder until it was deafening. In a desperate attempt to escape, David lunged toward the window, his fingers fumbling to open it. But the glass was ice cold, and when he pressed his palms against it, they stuck, as though frozen in place. Panic surged through him, and he yanked his hands away, the cold biting into his skin. "You'll never leave," Emily's voice called, now right behind him. David spun around, his back pressed against the wall, and there she was, Emily, no longer pretending to be the innocent child he had seen before. Her form had twisted into something grotesque, her limbs elongated and contorted, her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Her eyes glowing with that sickly, unnatural light bored into him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. She floated toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape. No one ever does that." David's heart raced, his body trembling uncontrollably as he pressed himself harder against the wall. His mind raced, trying to think of anything, any way to break free from this nightmare, but the curse was too strong. It had wrapped itself around him, digging its claws into his very soul. Emily was inches away now, her cold, ghostly breath chilling his skin. He could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating him. There was no escape, no way out. And then, without warning, the doll still lying in the corner of the room let out a blood-curdling scream. It wasn't the voice of a child anymore. It was something far more primal, far more evil. The sound pierced through David's skull, making him clutch his head in agony. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his vision blurring as the room spun around him. The shadows twisted and wreathed, growing darker, more menacing, as Emily's form flickered and distorted. She was laughing now, her voice echoing in the void, her twisted figure looming over him like a predator, ready to strike. David's mind felt like it was unraveling, the weight of the curse pressing down on him, crushing him. He could hear the voices of the others who had been trapped before him, their tortured souls crying out in agony, begging for release. But there was no release, only darkness. David's vision dimmed as the room around him faded into shadow. Emily's voice was the last thing he heard before everything went black. "You're mine now, David, forever, Doc." Part 9. Bound to the curse. David lay sprawled on the cold, unforgiving floor, his body trembling from the icy grip of fear. Every muscle screamed for him to move, but he couldn't. His mind was clouded, overwhelmed by the relentless horror that surrounded him. The room was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy, and somewhere in the distance, Emily's eerie laughter echoed, taunting him. His breath came in ragged gasps as the realization settled in his bones there was no escape. He was bound to the curse now, just like Mark and Sarah. David's thoughts flickered to his friends, now hollowed out shells of their former selves, prisoners to the cursed doll they had so foolishly brought into their lives. He had seen it in their eyes, the same despair, the same helplessness that was now creeping into his own soul. They had believed the doll would bring them wealth, success, a way out of their struggles. But instead, it had become their captor, and now it was his. Emily's ghostly form materialized before him, her twisted smile stretching impossibly wide as she floated toward him. Her once innocent features had long since faded, replaced by something far more sinister, far more monstrous. Her glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto David with a predatory gaze. "You understand now, don't you?" she whispered, her voice a sickening blend of childlike sweetness and malicious glee. "You're mine now, David, just like Mark and Sarah, just like all the others." David's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like the toll of a death bell. His mind raced, searching for any possible way to break free, but the weight of the curse was suffocating, dragging him deeper into its clutches. He could feel it, an invisible chain wrapping tighter around him with every passing second, binding him to this nightmare. Mark and Sarah were slumped in the corner of the room, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes glazed over with a lifeless sheen. They had surrendered to the curse long ago, their wills broken, their souls drained. They were no longer the people he once knew. The vibrant couple he had laughed and shared memories with had been replaced by hollow puppets, controlled by the whims of the cursed doll. David's throat tightened as Emily's form hovered inches above him, her cold breath brushing against his skin. He wanted to scream, to push her away, but his voice was trapped just like he was. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, suffocating him under the weight of his impending doom. "It's no use fighting," Emily hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll only make it worse. The more you resist, the stronger I become." The truth of her words sliced through David like a blade. He could feel it in his bones, she wasn't lying. The more he struggled, the deeper the curse rooted itself into his very soul. It was relentless, unbreakable, feeding off his fear, his desperation. Emily's laughter filled the room again, louder this time, more menacing. The shadows on the walls seemed to pulse and shift in time with the sound, growing darker, more twisted. David could feel the darkness creeping closer, seeping into his skin, his mind. The curse was no longer just something he could see or hear, it was inside him, consuming him from within. His eyes darted to the doll, still sitting in the corner, its blank porcelain face staring back at him with an unnerving calm. It was so small, so seemingly fragile, and yet it held so much power. How could something so innocent looking be the source of such terror? But David knew the truth now. That doll was no mere object. It was a vessel, a conduit for Emily's vengeance. And she wouldn't stop until she had consumed them all. Why? David's voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw from the terror that had gripped him for what felt like an eternity. "Why are you doing this?" Emily's ghostly form tilted her head, her smile widening. "Why?" she repeated mockingly. "Because I can. Because I made a deal. And now you're part of it." David's mind spun. He had heard bits of the story from Mark of their desperate trip to Thailand, their foolish pact with forces they didn't understand. They had believed they could control the spirit within the doll, that they could harness its power for their own gain. But they were wrong, horribly, tragically wrong. And now they were paying the price. "It's not just about them, David," Emily continued, her voice softening, as if sharing a secret. "It's about you too. You see, the curse is hungry. It needs more than just their souls. It needs yours too." David's stomach turned, a wave of nausea washing over him. He could feel it, the curse tightening its grip, sinking deeper into his flesh, his mind. It was like a parasite, feeding on his fear, his despair. And there was no way out. The room began to spin, the walls warping and shifting as the curse twisted reality around him. David could barely tell what was real anymore. The doll's face seemed to melt and reform, Emily's figure flickered in and out of existence, and the shadows on the walls moved with a life of their own. "Let go," Emily whispered, her voice right next to his ear now. "Stop fighting. It's easier that way. You'll see. It doesn't have to hurt." David shook his head weakly, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mind was unraveling, fraying at the edges as the curse dug deeper, pulling him under. He could hear Mark and Sarah's voices now, echoing in his head, a chorus of despair. "There's no escape," Mark's voice rasped, hollow and distant. "We tried, but she won't let us. Geo. It's over," Sarah added, her voice barely more than a whisper. "She owns us now. And soon, she'll own you too. David squeezed his eyes shut, willing the voices to stop, but they only grew louder, more insistent. The weight of the curse was crushing him, pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. And then, suddenly, the room went silent. David opened his eyes, blinking against the sudden stillness. Emily was gone. The doll remained in the corner, but the oppressive energy in the room had lifted, if only slightly. He could hear his own breathing again, the frantic pounding of his heart in his chest. For a moment he thought it was over, that maybe, just maybe, he had been spared. But then the doll moved. Its head turned slowly, its porcelain eyes locking onto his with a cold, unfeeling stare. And then, in a voice that was both childlike and filled with something ancient and terrible, it spoke. "You're bound to me now." David's heart dropped, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He had known it deep down, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. There was no escape, no way out. The curse had him now, just like it had Mark and Sarah. The doll's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, its eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. Forever, it whispered, its voice filled with dark promise. And then, the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. David's scream echoed through the house, but no one was there to hear it. No one ever would. Mark and Sarah sat in the corner, their eyes dull, their faces blank. They had been through this before. They knew how it ended. The curse never released its victims. It only tightened its grip, pulling them deeper into the darkness until there was nothing left. David was just the latest in a long line of souls to be consumed. And soon there would be more. Because the curse was unbreakable, and Emily was always hungry.